Floor is all yours.
Good afternoon, all. It's wonderful to be with you. Thank you for the very generous invitation and the very kind opening words. I've lost track of time, but I think this is the end of my 17th year at Rice, my 17th year in Houston. There's only one place I've lived longer, and that's Buffalo, New York, where I grew up. For as long as I can remember, I've been deeply interested in the intersections of race and religion. That is to say, I've been very, very interested in what religion tells us about race and what race tells us about religion. What kind of vocabulary and grammar do they share? What are the ways in which they produce a similar perspective on the fundamental questions of life? Who are we? When are we? Why are we? What are we? Initially, this started with an interest in ordained ministry. So before I could stay out longer than, before I could stay out after the streetlights came on, I was involved in church. I started preaching as a preteen, and that continued. My first year in college, I was ordained, and my assumption was that I would work in a way within the context of organized religion, within the community of Christian believers. I would work to think through the relationship between religion and race, and do that in a way that allowed folks to move through the world with health and well-being. My interest in ministry would fade over time, but what remained of deep importance to me was this intersection, that within the context of the United States and beyond, race and religion have been cultural forces that have influenced and informed. Both race and religion have been a reason to live and a reason to kill. And I wanted to understand those intersections. I finished graduate school and I took my first teaching job in St. Paul, Minnesota at Macalester College. And I was fairly happy there. 8 years in, I was a full professor, and I received a phone call from Bill Parsons in the religion department asking me to come and visit Rice for a semester. Initially, I said no, not because I wasn't interested in Rice, but I was on sabbatical, and the idea of giving up my sabbatical to go somewhere else and teach just wasn't appealing. There were projects I needed to finish. And so we asked when might be a good time to come. We worked out a time and I came to visit for a semester. Now, mind you, I'd only been in Texas, only been in Houston one other time prior to that. It was on a fundraising trip with the VP for development from Macalester College, and it was in July. He had on a suit, I had on a suit, and the folks we were visiting wanted to go walk around Rice Village. I had never encountered such heat before. And I told Richard as we were heading back to the airport, man, I don't know how people do this. I don't understand how they could possibly do this. I felt I was melting. I said, I can't see myself being there. 2 years later, I was packing up and moving. At Rice, my interest in the intersections of race and religion have continued. And I've wanted to get at that in a variety of ways. And I wanted to do that beyond what I write and what I teach. And so a little over a decade ago, I developed the Center for Engaged Research and Collaborative Learning. And for me, it's a outward-facing, a public-facing organization that is all about helping Rice to rethink its relationship with the larger Houston community, to recognize that there's a wealth of resource, a wealth of know-how, a wealth of cultural information that is outside of the hedges, and we have an obligation to bring it in and learn from it. That is not simply Rice giving to the larger Houston community, but it's Rice learning to appreciate what this larger Houston community offers, and to do that in ways that transforms how we think about resources, how we think about research, how we think about teaching, how we think about service. More recently, I've served as the inaugural director of the Center for African and African American Studies, and there are a good number of my colleagues on campus who are doing tremendous work in African studies and African American studies. They're gaining media attention and they're producing wonderful students and producing fantastic publications. But they're known in terms of their individual contributions. And my thinking is we are greater than the sum of our parts, that the presence of these folks on campus says something about Rice's ability to contribute something fantastic to the larger national and international conversation concerning African and African American studies, that we want to grow in such a way that it is impossible to have conversation concerning race and not bring into play Rice University. The importance of these issues has only increased over the past decade. And so the work we're trying to do with respect to these centers has only gained significance and importance based upon what has happened over the course of a decade. Over the past 2 years, this has been intensified as we've wrestled with how we teach, what it means to be together, what it means to teach and to research within the context of a pandemic. And we've done that not only in terms of COVID, but in terms of our need to wrestle with anti-Black racism in a new way. The murder of George Floyd pointed us in a different direction, forced us to come to grips with a very different way of thinking about the nature of race within the context of our democracy. This has influenced and informed my teaching. I teach a course called Religion and Black Lives Matter, and I'm committed to teaching it every year I teach until the topic is no longer relevant. But until then, I teach it every year. And for me, it is my most exciting, but also my most difficult course. We're trying to learn from Black Lives Matter, not only how we think about categories of hope and future, how we think about redemption and transformation, but we also want to use Black Lives Matter as a way to rethink how we engage each other, how we understand expertise, how we understand leadership. And for me, this requires more than just teaching this material. It also requires trying to model this new way of thinking. So the Black Lives Matter movement in part argues that we have to move away from the charismatic leader model. I think in terms of the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King Jr., that we have to move away from that model and begin to more fully recognize that folks have the capacity to do wonderful things. We all have the capacity to be involved in transformative ways. And so they move from a charismatic leader, from a hierarchical structure, to the understanding that Black Lives Matter as a movement is leaderful. No one person, everybody plays a significant role. And for them, this has been beneficial in a variety of ways, that you can't dismantle one, you cannot dismantle Black Lives Matter by targeting a particular leader, because everyone has capacity. No one person speaks for the movement. Now, in this class, we've tried to model that. So I am a co-learner. I am no more in charge of that time together in that class than any of the students. So together, we determine course requirements. Together, we determine how those course requirements will be graded. There is no final exam. There is no final paper. The students as a group are obligated as their final assignment to come up with public events that speak to the course material. I don't determine what those events are. I don't even vote on them. My job is to help them manage the resource. My center, the Center for Engaged Research and Collaborative Learning, gives the students, if we are online, $3,000, if we are in person, $5,000 as their budget for this event. And they determine how the themes from the course should be represented. They determine how they as individuals will be graded on their participation and how members of their group will be graded. They have done some fantastic work over the times I've taught this course. They have done fantastic work. That has been important for me. And I'm learning how to teach differently based upon social activism. That so many of us, and myself included, want to think about the work we do within the academy, again, as being public facing, as having implications beyond the confines of our classrooms and our libraries. And the question then is, what's the look of this new type of engagement? And how do academics, who are by and large privileged, how do we recognize that privilege in a way that allows us to contribute? This course has been an opportunity for me to relearn some stuff and to get rid of some poor thinking. I owe a debt of gratitude to the students who've taken this course over the 3 times that I've taught it thus far. My research agenda, in large part over the past few years, in light of the pandemic and in light of these most graphic forms of anti-Black racism, has required a return to some of the figures I've thought about over the course of 2 decades. One being W.E.B. Du Bois, the first African-American to receive a PhD from Harvard University, a founding figure in sociological studies and a premier historian. I am so mindful of what he says in that wonderful book published in 1903, The Souls of Black Folk. In that book, he raises a problem, a question really, that continues to confront us. How does it feel to be a problem? Now, he's addressing this to African Americans, and white Americans are reading the book, they're listening in, and he's raising the question, how does it feel to be a problem? In 2022, we look at this in light of the civil rights movement, its gains and its failures. We come to this question in light of the feminist movement, the gay rights movement, the movement for Black lives. How does it feel to be a problem? W.E.B. Du Bois is raising this question in light of the failures of Reconstruction and the continued animosity, the violent disregard that people of African descent face. For him, on one level, this is a matter of access to the promises of democracy, but for him, it's more than that. It's not simply political participation, economic opportunity, educational opportunity. For him, it's a deeper realization. Those things are important, but for Du Bois, there's also this underlying question. What does it mean to be fundamentally despised for who you are? How does it feel to be a problem? So I'm wrestling with issues of religion and race in light of that fundamental question and bringing into play 2 of my other favorite thinkers. The author Richard Wright, wonderful text, Black Boy, American Hunger, Native Son, The Outsiders, is raising these sorts of questions. What does it mean to live well within the context of the United States when you are part of a despised population? What does it mean to talk of hope, of future, of liberation, of freedom from the margins of society? I think with Richard Wright, and I think with him in combination with another of my favorite thinkers, Albert Camus, the North African Albert Camus, who seems to be wrestling with a very similar set of issues, but he phrases it in terms of absurdity. From his vantage point, humans want answers. That makes sense, yeah? Humans want answers. And we pose our questions with passion and commitment to the universe, and we are met with silence. Our relationship to the universe is absurd. We ask questions, and to those questions, we are given silence. So I'm wrestling with this, trying to think through this in terms of religion, particularly Black religion and culture, the nature of democratic processes in the United States. What does it mean to think of hope? What does it mean to speak of future? What does it mean to speak of freedom and liberation within the context of ongoing demise? And so I turn to these thinkers, in part because with Richard Wright and Albert Camus, there's a recognition of the troubled nature of our collective existence. And for both of them, they give us the freedom to think beyond resolution. So the civil rights movement, for example, is outcome driven. You know you are making progress, you know you are doing the right thing because circumstances change. But what of a context in which they don't seem to change? Where the presidency of Barack Obama is followed by January 6th. How do we think about our well-being? How do we think about progress within those sorts of contexts? And I find these thinkers intriguing because both of them suggest a movement away from outcome-driven strategies and a recognition that we are involved in a perpetual struggle. That if there is liberation, if there is freedom, perhaps it is in our very ability to say no to injustice, and to say no to injustice with increased volume and commitment. That in that struggle against injustice, we might find something of our humanity, of our freedom. Camus comes to this realization thinking about Sisyphus. Perhaps you're familiar with Sisyphus. This is the dude who is punished by the Greek gods. And this punishment involves having to roll this large stone up a hill. He reaches the top, it comes back down, and the process starts all over again. And this is forever. According to Zeus and the others, this will break Sisyphus. It will crush him. But Albert Camus argues, no, it doesn't crush him. That what Sisyphus gains is awareness, lucidity, a better understanding of his circumstances, and he isn't crushed by these circumstances. Albert Camus ends this very short essay on Sisyphus with these words: one must imagine Sisyphus happy. He doesn't say Sisyphus is happy. He says one must imagine Sisyphus happy, that something of lucidity, a deeper awareness of our circumstances, a commitment to say no to injustice. Something about that houses our freedom, houses our well-being. In thinking with these figures, over the past couple of years, I've worked hard to try to rethink the vocabulary and grammar I use within my work. And to think in terms of the poetic quality of this work. And by poetic, I mean the destruction of language to free it to tell a very different story. A dismantling of our language to free language to tell a very different story. To tell a story from the margins of life. To privilege the margins of life. I've tried to do that in terms of recent publications, and I've tried to do that in a way that is mindful of an academic audience, but also a popular audience. And for me, there have been two tests of this, two ways in which I've tried to reorient my thinking, to think differently, to think beyond the comfort of academic jargon. The first was through the visual arts. I am not an artist. I make no claim to being an artist. But for a while, I used painting as a way to force myself to think differently about ideas. It helped to develop a different sense of humility concerning my ability to articulate ideas, and to articulate ideas without the comfort, the ease of academic jargon. More recently, I tried to do that in terms of this novel, to wrestle with issues that were of deep concern to me, that kind of anchored who I am as an academic, and to do it without jargon. So that novel is about one of the fundamental concerns for me as an academic who is trained as a theologian. And it revolves around this area of thought that gets at human suffering and moral evil. Academics often call this theodicy. What can you say about God in light of human suffering in the world? That question has anchored much of my scholarship over the past 30 years. I've wrestled with it in a variety of ways, explicitly and implicitly. How do we wrestle with human suffering? What do we make of human suffering? How does this impact our cultural life together? But how does it inform and influence and shape our religious sensibilities? In that novel, I wrestle with this through a priest who's working in an inner city context. And he's wrestling with these issues. What is our moral obligation with respect to evil, with respect to suffering in the world? What is our moral obligation? And what is the nature of full involvement in an effort to wrestle against that? And I tried to work that through without, again, jargon, and to do it in a way that offers no easy answers. And so that novel ends without there being any resolution. The novel suggests, and much of my academic work suggests, that a fuller appreciation for the integrity of human life, a fuller appreciation for the depths of misery that some encounter requires a refusal to provide an answer to that question. What can we say about God in light of human suffering in the world? In the context of my work, I offer no answer. For me, what it does is prompt additional questions and concerns that I think in some respects, my work on religion and culture has involved an effort as a matter of teaching, but also as a matter of research. It has involved an effort to foster a greater comfort with discomfort. That is to say, to develop the ability to linger over profound questions and concerns and not cut so quickly to answers, but to linger over these scenarios, to linger over the difficulties of life in a way that affords us an opportunity to ask better questions, to create greater comfort with discomfort. In my work, and the movement for Black Lives Matter has just reinforced this, and in my work, I try to do this in a way that doesn't assume masculinity. That is to say that I want to wrestle with issues of freedom and justice and transformation and hope and future in a way that doesn't assume that all of this gets resolved from the perspective of men moving through the world. I'll give you an example of what I mean. It's to understand the depth of human misery and the effort to counter that misery, not strictly from the perspective of Frederick Douglass, but from the perspective of Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth. To rethink the vocabulary and grammar we use to describe struggle and to do it in a way that doesn't assume the masculine. And so for me, one of the ways to do this has involved reconnecting with this wonderful, wonderful, wonderful figure, Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray. She was the first African-American woman ordained an Episcopal priest. As an attorney, her thought helped to shape the strategies employed by Thurgood Marshall and Brown versus the Board of Education. And so I'm reconnecting with her. I published some years ago, almost 20 years ago now, a collection of her sermons and lectures. And I'm revisiting that. I've expanded that collection to give a fuller sense of how she wrestled with pressing issues of her day. And Pauli Murray is important for me because she doesn't allow us to assume that there is only one form of oppression we need to target and challenge. To end racism is not to save the world, it is to take a strike at injustice. But oppression is web-like in nature. And so ending racism isn't enough. We have to tackle gender, transphobia, classism, ableism. And Pauli Murray forces us to wrestle with that because she's constantly asking the question, whose suffering are we ignoring? Whose suffering are we contributing to? And I think those are important questions for us to ask. Finally, I've tried to do this in a way that tackles sacred text as well. So within the context of African-American religion, the Bible, as you might imagine, has been an extremely important text. It has provided in some really significant ways the moral and ethical vision for life utilized within, say, the Black church. The Bible has been important. But if I read the Bible in light of current circumstances, if I read the Bible in light of my conversation with W.E.B. Du Bois, how does it feel to be a problem? If I read the Bible in light of my conversation with Albert Camus, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. If I read the Bible in light of my engagement with Pauli Murray, whose misery are we forgetting? It affords a very different interpretive tool. So I recently gave a series of lectures, the men's lectures for the Unitarian Universalist Association, and then a series of 3 lectures, the Curry lectures for Austin Presbyterian Seminary. And those lectures were an opportunity for me to reread certain biblical stories through my conversation with Du Bois, Richard Wright, Albert Camus, Pauli Murray, and to read these in light of a fundamental question. Whose misery have we forgotten? So I'll give you an example. For me, this has involved a very different take on Job's wife. That story, the book of Job, we typically read from the vantage point of Job, that here is a person, right, who has done everything right. The scriptural account makes this clear. Job, there is no moral or ethical shortcoming with Job. But Job encounters misery, suffering. His children are taken away. His material goods are gone, all to test his loyalty to God. His friends assume Job has done something wrong. And here's the catch. Job's wife, who's never named in the story, says to Job, Job, curse God and die. Now, she's typically read as a problem. Major commentaries and major religious figures, theologians and ethicists have argued that Job's wife is out of line, that this is a problem. From my vantage point, if you read this from the perspective of Job's wife, it affords a very different take. Job isn't the only one who lost these children for no reason. Job's wife lost her children. Job isn't the only one who loses his home and all of his possessions. Job's wife also loses. But it seems to me Job's wife is the only one who appreciates the integrity of human life. For everyone else in the story, Job, and forget about Job's wife, she's not mentioned in terms of loss, but Job is a pawn He's an object moved around in order to prove some sort of larger cosmic argument. It is only Job's wife who recognizes his subjectivity. It is only Job's wife who really recognizes the depth of his misery and pain. It's Job's wife who argues this depth of misery and pain is such that there is no answer. With Job's wife, one gets another possibility that entails a certain comfort with discomfort. That it seems to me on one level, what Job's wife is arguing is there are certain circumstances that we cannot conquer. There are certain circumstances in which the only decision we get to make is how we occupy time and space. That something of our integrity, something of our value is in our willingness to say, no, these circumstances make no sense. To confront the absurdity of life, Job's friends confront the absurdity of life and say, Job, you are wrong. Job's wife confronts the absurdity of life and says, your integrity matters. You're more than the story says you are, Job. I find that deeply appealing. That I think within the context of our current circumstances, there's something of merit in the idea that our struggle is perpetual. That there is something of our well-being, something of our integrity found in our willingness to say no to injustice, recognizing that we will have to say no to injustice over and over and over and over again. Albert Camus says one must imagine Sisyphus happy. Fight the good fight, no matter how long it takes. I think these are important lessons for us. And over the past few years, those sorts of challenges, this discomfort, this comfort with discomfort, a recognition that circumstances require a very different take on the vocabulary and grammar we make use of in describing our world and our place in it, for me have been life-giving. I'm going to stop there and perhaps we can chat.
I was looking to unmute myself.
Karen, yeah, you had a question, but I first want to point out that Amanda referenced, if we want to know a little more, Dr. Pinn's thoughts, a podcast, I believe that he did. So if you look in the chat, you can get that. Karen?
Oh, well, now I'm doubting I just love the end about changing our language, our vocabulary to confront things.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough, right? But if we
well,
are honest about our history, we have tried over and over again to dismantle wrongdoing.
Mm-hmm.
And no one effort we've made has won the day. Reconstruction fails. The civil rights movement, there are certain gains, but there's ongoing misery, right? So the question becomes, if we are going to be honest with ourselves about our history, what does this mean in terms of the strategies we employ? How we think about our world, how we discuss our world, and how we maneuver to change our world. The issues are much more complex than we've let on.
Oh my, I was saying even choosing the right words to talk about what we think. I think Piper has a question.
I am very involved in local politics and somewhat in national politics and also in grassroots movements in general. And I think right now, I was very moved by what you said at the end, because I feel like people are exhausted. We feel like all we've done is fight against, Trumpism and all the things. Plus, of course, trying to improve lives for Black people, for women, for those in poverty. And so how do you see, since it is a continual struggle, how do you, keep the momentum going without being exhausted?
Yeah, that's a tough one, isn't it? Particularly if the strategy isn't outcome driven, if you don't have those particular, we don't see those benchmarks as conclusive. And so it seems to me that the energy, the motivation should come from the idea that this is our best possibility, right? Why do we do this work? Why do we labor? Because we can. Because we can. And it's, I get it. Most of my colleagues don't agree with this thinking. And many of my colleagues have said that this thinking comes from a point of privilege. And of course, there's a certain degree of privilege here, but those who are accusing me of privilege are at very similar institutions, right? So I'm mindful of that, but I'm not persuaded by it. And I would argue that more than this, that the privilege comes in with me having the resource and the comfort to look back over history, right? That Rice affords me a space to look back. And I think if we're honest about what we see when we look back, it raises some really uncomfortable questions. So think in terms of January 6th. And we tend to think about it as a failure to live out the best of our democratic principles. But there's also another way to see this. Perhaps what we have seen in terms of animosity regarding certain populations is this country functioning properly. What does it mean to struggle for a different world if democracy is functioning as intended? That isn't very comfortable. But again, my argument is that what we see if we look across history is the utility in disrupting the conversation, right? So again, Reconstruction didn't end it. The fight for women to have voting rights didn't end discrimination, but it disrupts the conversation. It disrupts the status quo. And that's something. Now, I don't want to downplay the value of disruption. If nothing else, disruption causes us to rethink what we've assumed to be normative. It exposes social codes and processes that we have just assumed, that haven't required conversation. We just assume them. But this sort of disruption raises the question concerning those social codes, the status quo, and gives us opportunity to think new thoughts. Now, those thoughts may not win the day, but they disrupt. And I think there's something of our liberty, something of our freedom, something of our transformation in that disruption.
Maybe recognizing, am I muted?
I hear you.
You're good.
You can hear me. Maybe recognizing this replaces frustration and exhaustion with hope. You're not always reaching for the end. You just keep on reaching.
I would agree. We just keep on reaching. In my own work, I want to bracket the terminology of hope and just think in terms of the persistence of possibility. For me, that is for me, that kind of captures where we are a little better than hope, the persistence of possibility.
You can sure tell you're an academic when you say to bracket the word hope. Carol Ann?
Well, as a retired teacher, I'm very concerned about these parents who want to go about banning books, and the lifespan of these students whose parents who want to ban books for everybody. You know, if you want to ban these books for your own children, that's perfectly fine, but don't ban them for the whole school. And, you know, that having hope, it becomes very difficult for me, that because if they prevail and have these books removed from the libraries, it makes me very frustrated.
I would agree with you. But I see the persistence of possibility even in that so many young people, right? So for me, the key is critical thinking skills and effective communication strategies. Encourage young people to ask really good questions. And I think even if books are challenged, there's no way these same parents can really shut off the kind of probing and questioning that takes place on social media. The movement for Black Lives, that wasn't book-based, that's social media, right? That's Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. And so I think there are other ways in which we can continue to foster the value of questions.
And I put a question in the chat that I'll just ask. What are your thoughts about the plans for the statue of Mr. Rice?
Yes, well, I'm on the task force, and I'm in favor of it being moved. Mm-hmm. I think it is a small price to pay to recognize Rice's relationship to certain forms of disregard, right? Rice's connection, like so many other institutions, Rice's connection to anti-Black racism. It is a small request, but from my vantage point, it's insufficient, right? That we have to think about the movement of that statue in relationship to the larger agenda that the task force is going to provide. That I think this is a unique moment for Rice University. A unique moment. We won't get this ever again. An opportunity to live out our commitments, to live out our mission more fully. And again, comfort with discomfort. Mm-hmm. That this won't be easy. And this will annoy some while it invigorates others. And I think it's the obligation of the university to clearly articulate what's happening and why.
Thank you. I appreciate that answer. Miranda?
Thank you, and thank you so much, Dr. Pinn, for your wonderful remarks. I'm a religion, or at the time it was religious studies grad, class of 1997. So I think I may have been in Bill Parsons' very first class at 8 o'clock in the morning, religion and the social sciences. Mm-hmm. And I went on to pursue an MA and PhD in religious studies. So I was really interested in what you had to say about pedagogy and about mm-hmm. working with your students. And the flexibility and creativity that you described is really remarkable. But one of the things that I've always found very interesting about religion in the academy mm-hmm. is that it's really often asking students to think about things that are deeply, deeply significant to them in a very different way. Mm-hmm. So sometimes that's really trying to treat it in a sort of I don't want to say objective, but a more academic way. But it sounds like you're almost moving into a way of engaging with the subject, but perhaps not in the way students are accustomed to, maybe not in the way that they're used to from the way that they were brought up. So can you talk a little bit about how, what you've seen in students, how they've responded, what maybe they've struggled with a little bit, if you've seen any changes over your career in how students come to a religion classroom in higher education context?
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I think on one level, over the course of time, students self-select, right? So they learn something about faculty, how faculty position themselves, and they pick accordingly, right? So I think on one level, over the course of 27 years, the posture of my students, the kind of intellectual posture towards my students has remained fairly consistent because they self-select. And so all of these students over the 27 years have been willing to think about religion outside of the confines of doctrines, creeds, and institutional forms. right? They hang out with me because they get an opportunity to do that. So they've all been comfortable with that. From McAllister to Rice, right? From Minnesota to the Bible Belt, I've constantly encountered students, a mix of students, some of them deeply invested in religious community and others who are deeply suspicious, but all of them willing to wrestle with religion in respectful ways, whether they claim it or not. Right? No gotcha moments, no belittling, a willingness to engage, recognizing for populations, this is significant. Whether it works for you or not, for certain populations, this is significant. How do we understand that? So all of the students have been willing to kind of think about religion based upon a very different definition, that religion is a quest for complex subjectivity. That is to say, religion is a fundamental effort to wrestle with the questions of human existence. Who are we? When are we? Why are we? What are we? And that the effort to answer those will bubble up historically and take the form of doctrines, creeds, et cetera. But all of the students are, whether they position themselves in religious community or not, are curious and kind of open to possibilities that don't necessarily fit their own thinking. Mm-hmm. So that's a long-winded way of saying that over the 27 years, I think in part because of self-selection, the students and their kind of intellectual curiosity, their kind of personal desires, their personal motivation, the biography that brings them to the class has remained somewhat consistent. What has changed is the number of students from underrepresented groups I get. So I can see the increase in undergraduates from underrepresented groups at Rice when I look at my classroom.
Do you ever get complaints about when you were talking about how the students decide how you go forward in your classes and how the grading is carried out? And do you ever get complaints? I was a high school principal.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times students and parents would come to me and feel like a teacher wasn't putting forth enough effort to educate to give an education in whatever subject it was. And I wondered when you said that,
yeah,
if of course, I always feel like at Rice, you might be afraid to complain, but
yeah, so
about that.
Yeah, that's interesting. The very first time I taught it, the first session was all about our process. Mm-hmm. And I tried to explain to the best of my ability why we were doing it this way and what I hoped we would get out of it. And that if that process didn't work for them, cool, perhaps I'd see them in a different class, but this class was going to function this way. Mm-hmm. And I think the way in which resistance often comes up is not in terms of the grading, but I'll often get over the course of time, we want to hear more from you. We don't want to hear from our classmates. We want to hear more from you. That's code for, can't you just lecture? Which runs contrary. We're learning this together, that I'm not going to lecture in this class, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. We're learning this together. And I think over time, all of these students have come to recognize that there are real benefits in them being somewhat accountable and responsible for their learning experience, that active learning is a good thing.
Well, given the possibilities that they could come up with, you know, all the ideas they have would be a profit to me.
And I just, you know, in terms of the classroom, I've never really enjoyed lecturing. It's not my preferred way of being in the classroom. Mm-hmm. I'm much more interested in sharing some thoughts, and then we have a conversation. Again, one of the things that I think I have an obligation to help students develop is their critical thinking skills. And they can't, from my vantage point, they can't refine their critical thinking skills by just listening to me talk.
Mm-hmm. My daughter is an international baccalaureate teacher, and there are no yes and no. You know, well, just tell us. And she says, well, you have to find it out, and that's sometimes hard for them. What's your favorite thing about teaching at Rice?
I think my favorite thing about teaching at Rice is the flexibility we have. It's a kind of open process. We can push to do things differently, and there's support for that. Mm-hmm. Right? We get to really teach our interests. So I'll give you an example. I am a huge hip hop fan, have always been a huge hip hop fan. I grew up on hip hop. Hip hop in some way, shape, or form influences everything I teach and everything I write. I am a hip hop fan. When I got to Houston, I could do this differently. That so many of the artists I listened to growing up live in Houston, right? They're Houston-based artists. I mean, it's just kind of mind-blowing. And so I wanted to teach this course on hip hop culture differently, that the students didn't just need to hear from me, they needed to engage artists. That one of the benefits being at Rice in a course on hip hop ought to be access to what's taking place in the larger Houston community. Mm-hmm. And so I didn't want to do this in a way that just meant kind of bringing artists through. They talk for 15 minutes, they go about their business, but it's really all about me. I wanted to team teach with an artist. And so I picked Bun B.
Mm-hmm. I read about
And
it.
if you just Google Bun B, you might have issues, right? If you just Google him, you might have issues. And I give Rice credit for this, from David Lebrun all the way down, that folks said, you know, I don't necessarily understand this, but go for it, do it. Mm-hmm. And it was a tremendous learning experience for me. I don't know what students got out of it, but it was a tremendous learning experience for me. And it also helped certain segments of the Houston population rethink Rice and rethink possibilities with Rice. But I don't know that I could have done that everywhere.
Well, we now have in the chat box a link to a 21, whatever. It's a.
I posted that. Dr. Pinn, I work at the Baker Institute.
Good.
We met in the elevator the other day, and I posted your conversation with Bun B that you did for the Baker Institute in 2020. It's a great conversation.
That was so much fun, so much fun.
How was your time with Dr. Gates? I think I told you I was watching that in Black Religion in America, or whatever the name of the program was. And it reminded me I should touch base because you were going to come be our speaker. How was your work with him?
You know,
different polls.
He wasn't present all that much.
Oh.
Most of my interaction with him was through email, right? Kind of responding to his questions. So I was also a consultant for the script. And so it was a matter of kind of responding to the script, and he might have questions concerning what I was suggesting, and he'd write about that. But we weren't in the same room ever.
Oh,
but I had a ball. It was fantastic. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
It's a great series. I did.
And I think it's, you know, and I say this having been involved, I think it's one of the things that's really interesting for me about that is it paints a rather complex picture of the Black church. Mm-hmm. It's not one-dimensional, right? You get a sense of what it has done well, and you also get a sense of where it has completely screwed up, right? It's a complex and layered depiction.
Well, we're growing, it's getting down to 1:30 and our time will be up. We have maybe time for one more question. And your hand is up, Wee Chan.
Yes. So I've been listening to what Dr. Pinn saying, And I know in the academic environment that people are very inquisitive, very curious, which we all are. And then I also learned that we are not looking for answers because the answer is still in progress. And we also need to accept that during the process, we are very unsettling, okay? So if I take that 4 criteria, inquisitive, curiosity, unsettling, and not looking for answer, and if I expand that to general community or general population, I realize they have all 4 of them, but they are looking for the answer in the wrong place. And they are looking for quick answers. So that's what I see when they try to stop book from reading, when they start trying to change the voting policy. So how are we going to carry the 4 important criteria to the general public so they could think more like what they should be? I mean, I'm not trying to control their thinking. So how are we going to extrapolate that process to the general public?
We push, right? We raise questions, we push. It seems to me this banning of books, this rather bizarre attack on critical race theory is all about maintaining comfort, right? It's about maintaining comfort.
Right.
And from my vantage point, one of the best things we can do is disrupt that.
But I don't want to waste my energy on their wrong agenda.
Right, but I don't think that disrupting it or raising the questions is playing into their agenda, right? It seems to me raising questions for folks who want to maintain comfort runs contrary to their agenda.
Yeah.
So from my vantage point, it's about forcing questions, probing, interrogating.
So asking the question, Wei Chen. We got to take our picture. So everybody, turn your face on, if you will, please. But first, before we do this, because that's our very last act at each of our lectures, let's give Dr. Pinn a hand.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed the chat.
Well, you went